So agriculture traceability is already a reality, right? So in 2020, we published this paper with our German, American colleagues showing that we have the means, okay? But we need to develop public and transparent systems. Certification, our recommendation at that time, certification does not work. And then came or is coming UDR, European Deforestation Regulation. UK also has a regulation. So maybe it's coming, we don't know, right? So, anyway, neither has the means to implement traceability in the producer's country, especially in Brazil. So we have to provide the means for European Union, for UK and other countries willing to adopt traceability, right? So what are the challenges? So traceability must do a lot of checks, right? So what are the challenges? First is plot level in Brazil is property level because we have also to access legality. It's not only deforestation, but legality. So we have to develop high spatial resolution mapping. This is one of the challenges. We have to analyze the legality. We have the legislation, the forest code, so we have to analyze legality at the property level. And also we have to include indirect suppliers, especially cattle indirect suppliers, which is still a challenge, right? And we need platforms, easy to interpret, easy to use, right? And also to be legitimate. In other words, the platform must be hosted by state or federal governments, right, to be legitimate. Okay, and we're talking about Brazil, so it's a continental-wide challenge. Okay, next, please. What? Okay. Okay, so global mapping is not accurate regional, let alone locally. So we have to develop high-resolution map at the property level. This means analyzing properties from 4 hectares to 1,000, maybe 100,000 hectares. So just to compare, this is the ESA forest map, the European Forest Observatory, showing and was supposed to use as a cutoff data for detecting deforestation post-2020. But it's not accurate for Brazil. So this is we have a project for developing, we're integrating Sentinel with Planet, so running 5-meter spatial resolution. So it is one of the maps, you can check the project. So it's not only machine learning, deep learning, but also human. We have to do a lot of interaction, right? We have teams for sampling, for checking, for validating, so it's a lot of interaction with our team, not only running algorithms. Next, please. Oh, okay, I have sort of lost here. Okay, so Brazil has a very comprehensive legislation, which is called the Forest Code. So every property, every landowner must conserve part of the property as what we call legal reserve, native vegetation, and also conserve the riparian forest, the native vegetation along the river streams, water sources, and so on. And and now we have, and it's very important because half of the native vegetation in Brazil occurs on private land. So conservation of private land is also very important to tackle, right? So, okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, and we have our national registry. Every landowner must report, must upload the information, land use information of the property. This is a national system, it's a transparent system. We can download all the data, we can download all the boundaries of the what we call the car records, and of course we can analyze the compliance of the forest code across the country. So it is a, okay, 5 minutes. It's a big data challenge, right? So we are running the forest code model for, it's over 7.3 million records in Brazil. So for every property, we have the assessment of the forest code, whether the property is above or below compliance. You can access the site, and well, I think just okay. And with those tools, we are also providing the means to validate or to verify the self-report information, because it's very important. The car is also using for land grabber in Brazil. So we have to decommission those registries which have irregularities. So this is a system that we developed for Minas Gerais state. So we analyze about 1 million registries and to streamline the validation process of the self-report information. Nice jumping here. And Brazil has a very good sanitary control system. So every sales or buys of cattle, you have to issue a cattle transport permit. It's a sanitary system. And so using this information, we can trace even indirect suppliers, right? We can trace the movement of cattle from one property to the other up to the slaughterhouse. And we are developing a probabilistic model for assessing what we call the level of contamination by deforestation. And although now we have some initiatives to develop individual traceability, but we don't think this is going to fly. So we think this is an anti-solution right now. So we have to stick with the GTA, the sanitary system of Brazil. Okay, and this system we can trace from the property, but also from the slaughterhouse to the property. So we developed the system for the public prosecutors in Brazil to enforce the slaughterhouse to ban the forest from their supply chain. It's called MAP-ATAC. And of course, we need platforms so we can interpret the results. So Felipe is going to talk more about Selo Verde. I'm not going to touch the Selo Verde platform. And everything that we do, we base on our own in-house technology. So we have this dynamic EGO software, which is the base for developing our models. It's a freeware you can download, you can use. It's our framework, modeling framework. And also we have Map Earth, which it's a freeware, also open source, where we can build these interactive platforms. It's not working. Okay, so just to finalize, so we can say that Brazil has the right tools, right? We have territorial intelligence, but political willingness is faltering, not only Brazil. European Union is trying to roll back UDR, UK is sort of waiting to see what is happening, right? So thank you very much. We leave the questions for the end, right? Because we can have a really nice conversation. Felipe, take the floor.
Thank you very much, Britaldo. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for the opportunity and invitation to participate in such a big discussion and in such important moment with regulations, deforestation-free products regulations, law enforcement, land grabbing, and some tipping points knocking on the door in order to guarantee environmental governance and in Brazil and of course globally. And we will talk, of course, I will try to give you an overview of our co-producing science-based solutions for deforestation-free supply chains in Brazil. And in addition to the challenge, big challenge presented by Britaldo. We have the challenge behind co-producing science with the stakeholders, especially the government, and at the state level, at the federal level. And I'm Felipe Nunes. I'm a director of the Center for Territorial Intelligence and a researcher, associate researcher at the Remote Sensing Center at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And we have been working directly with this issue of how to implement and how to work together with the government, trying to separate, of course, our independence, our science independence, but co-produce science, co-produce knowledge in order to deliver public but science-based tools to inform deforestation-free products across supply chains, which is a big challenge, but we think that we have a window of opportunity to work together with the government in order to provide more information. It's not working. Yeah. Yes. And for this engagement process with the government, we decided to take this big effort of bridging science and policy. And of course, we need to materialize science and synthesize science, but work together with the government because, as you know, policymakers use a lot of information to provide decisions, to provide policies, and to implement policies. And science is one of the inputs. So we need to work and engage intensively with the state governments in Brazil in order to provide and implement what we call Selo Verde platform, which is the first science-based and public and transparent tool, including all rural properties officially registered in Brazil. And we need to work directly with the state governments because they own the data. They own the data of the movements of cattle herds, and in addition, the car registries, which is this system that we have a lot of georeferenced information covering all the territories in Brazil. And we implemented Selo Verde platform. Is already the platform is already operational at the Pará State, Maranhão, and Minas Gerais State. And we have been working to implement in Espírito Santo State, Tocantins, and Acre as well. And how does it work? Selo Verde combines a lot of data, of course, a lot of data sets, geospatial data, non-geospatial data, official data, and of course we need to protect personal and commercial data. And the first step is to integrate environmental, agricultural, land tenure, and law enforcement data sets, and which includes the car registry, the permits for deforestation. As you know, Brazil has legal and illegal deforestation, crop areas, pasture land, the animal transportation permits, conservation units, indigenous territories, and other law enforcement data such as infraction notes, embargoes, and slave labor as well. After integrating a lot of data, which is time consuming, which needs a lot of computer power, we build a geospatial database to carry out spatial analysis and modeling in order to synthesize and to summarize the data in order to provide better decisions in an easy way, providing reports and maps. And we developed this cattle traceability that Britaldo presented, accounting for direct and indirect suppliers, because we need to identify that deforestation indirect and indirectly across supply chain. So in the platform, we will show the deforestation-free direct suppliers, which is the supplier selling cattle without deforestation and buying cattle without deforestation. And there are some other options, which includes a direct supply deforesting their land and selling to the slaughterhouse, and direct suppliers without deforestation. sorry, but buying cattle from indirect suppliers with deforestation. So we need to cross and map all transactions in order to provide these classes of deforestation association. In Selo Verde, we begin in Pará State, the first platform, science-based, transparent and all-inclusive, because we mapped all rural properties in Pará State. It's about 300,000 rural properties with daily updates, because it's very important to provide information, but updated information regarding legality and deforestation, because as you know, land use can quick very fast. So this platform is already operational and it provides information. You just need to type the ID of the farm. We implemented as well Selo Verde in Minas Gerais state, covering coffee, soy, cattle, forest plantation, and sugarcane. And it's important to highlight the sugarcane sector. Just ask the government and ask us to support the inclusion in this platform, and they are not listed in the deforestation-free regulation. So we can see that traceability is a reality, and it's quite impressive to see the sector moving towards traceability. We implemented as well in Maranhão State, which is part of the Mato Piba, with a high deforestation rates in Brazilian context. And we are running about 300,000 rural properties with this information regarding legality and deforestation at the property level. And this can be a cutting edge tool because it combines tax evasion, of course, fiscal problems, especially in indirect sourcing of soy and cattle, and it exposes land conflicts. That slide summarizes how Selo Verde helping to attest deforestation-free farms and legality. If you are a rural producer, you can just check the legality and the occurrence of deforestation at your farm, and using just the car code, which is a public data for Brazil. And of course, the importers and operators and stakeholders can access this information as well, including query thousands or hundreds of farms if you are in the middle of a cooperative for coffee, for instance, with a lot of suppliers. And you can share the list of car codes with this legality and QR code and deforestation-free display with the competent authorities of UDR, UK, and you can see that by protecting personal and commercial information, we just display the legality and deforestation features. And of course, we are talking about UDR and the UK regulations, but China and USA and have already passed some bills they are discussing. And we think that we can help to combat deforestation, implementing this type of platform showing traceability at the property level. Thank you very much. I just leave you with the QR code. It's not working. And of course, we thank all the collaborators and the funders of the project. Thank you very much.
To share with you some research from my postdoc at Stanford that we just published, looking at where we did large spatial analysis of property overlaps in Brazil's CAR. And so, yeah, I'll be discussing the findings of that research today and the implications for supply chain traceability. Next, oh, I got this thing. Right. Oops. All right, great. So we've seen a growing number of demand-side measures for zero deforestation recently. And these are interventions that target the markets where commodities are consumed rather than where they're produced. So we've heard a lot about the EUDR recently, a due diligence requirement for companies importing deforestation into the EU. There's also been a number of corporate net zero pledges made recently that aim to address scope 3 emissions, or the indirect emissions in a company's supply chain. For example, the chocolate company Mars Inc. estimates that 30% of its total emissions are scope 3 generated by deforestation from imported commodities. So lots of activity there, and there's also a number of low carbon fuel programs in different jurisdictions that are trying to set up sustainability guardrails around crop-based feedstocks. And so I work on one of these programs for the state of California, and we've seen a lot of recent growth in biofuels entering the program, particularly soybean oil for the production as a feedstock for renewable diesel production. And with the expected demand in sustainable aviation fuel, this is going to continue to grow. So we need a way to certify that these feedstocks, these land-based feedstocks, are not causing deforestation. So all of these programs and policies are aiming more and more, striving for this farm-level supply chain traceability. But to really achieve the goal of zero deforestation, right, we need to think a little broader than just supply chains. So here's kind of a simplistic graph where we looked at the total amount of tropical deforestation in the top bar, and we tried to estimate the amount of that's actually covered by zero deforestation commitments today when you account for incomplete market coverage and implementation. And you can see it's a small amount. And if you look in the middle of the graph, commodity production only accounts for about a third of total tropical deforestation. And then only about a third of that is actually entering international supply chains where it's subject to consumer pressure for sustainability. So the high domestic consumption of commodities, there it is one issue that challenges the supply chain initiatives. But then you also just have this other 70% or so of deforestation that's not, it's kind of not immediately within reach of supply chain initiatives. And so we need to think about supply chains more in the broader mix of zero deforestation policies. And so that zero deforestation policy mix begins with a strong regulatory environment where you're protecting core forests out on the frontier, things like protected areas, stepped up law enforcement. And then typically incentives are layered onto that policy mix to expand alternative models of production so you can protect the remaining forests on private lands. So these are things like payments for ecosystem services. I guess I'll speak up some more. And you know, the supply chain initiatives that we're familiar with. But in the middle here, you have a really critical group of policies that make up the enabling environment of this policy mix. And so these are kind of the supporting policies that are the glue between public and private strategies. And so these can be implementation measures that bring multiple stakeholders together, like the Tropical Forest Alliance, but enabling measures are also discrete national policies that build institutional capacity. So things like national forest monitoring systems, systems of secure land tenure, for instance. And so Brazil's CAR falls into this category of enabling measures. It's got the ability to link deforestation with individual landholders. And when you can make that link, you can really unlock a lot more targeted policy options on both sides of this policy mix. So that's what I'll be discussing today is the kind of the potential of CAR to support supply chain traceability for both voluntary and legal compliance. And so I think we're all pretty familiar with the Forest Code. That's the reason the CAR was created, to support enforcement of the Forest Code. 80% of properties in the Amazon are required to be protected as a legal reserve. But the CAR is also being used to help support implementation of market-based strategies like the Amazon soy moratorium. And in fact, there's been some research that's shown that the greatest declines in deforestation associated with the soy moratorium were on lands that were both monitored by the moratorium and registered in the CAR, so some evidence of policy synergies there. Dead air. Okay, so here's a couple examples of CAR registrations. So these are self-declared property boundaries that the landholder uploads to this online system, the CCAR, and they're linked to their taxpayer identification number. And you can see that it includes the area that's designated as a legal reserve. Now, the CAR is not meant to, it's only meant to support environmental regularization or compliance with the Forest Code. It's not supposed to be used as evidence of land tenure. But one of the pitfalls of this self-declaration mechanism is that you're seeing the growing use of CAR as a tool to claim and clear public lands. And I think we saw a similar map in the plenaries this morning, but you can see that the Brazilian Amazon has over 50 million hectares of undesignated public forests, which are shown here on the map in orange. These are forest lands owned by the state or federal government that haven't been given a legal status yet. And so 20 million hectares of those have already been illegally claimed as private properties using the CAR. And most deforestation on those undesignated lands is happening inside of those CAR registered areas. So CAR is kind of being used as a surrogate proof of land ownership in this setting, which is then followed by land clearing to establish de facto possession of those lands. So we know that there's conflicts between the CAR and public lands, but there's also a lot of conflicts between, there's a lot of overlap between the CAR registrations themselves. So here's a snapshot of some CAR data, and you can see these private land conflicts highlighted in orange. Now the implications of what these private land conflicts mean for environmental or land tenure regularization has not been investigated very well yet. Previous researchers have kind of treated this more as a methodological issue rather than a policy one, so they've taken a number of steps to kind of deal with the CAR overlap issue to then answer other research questions. So in our study, we really take advantage of the information contained within the overlaps to try to understand how landholders are using the CAR to claim land and how then they respond to conflicts. This might work better from this side. So we asked a couple of questions at 3 different scales. At the property level, how are landholders responding to these private land conflicts? Zooming out to the regional level, what factors are contributing to more CAR overlap? And then finally, at the global level, just kind of want to reflect on whether this self-declaration mechanism is the right one for supply chain traceability. So, quick slide on methods. There's more in the paper I can share, but we use CAR data to quantify overlaps among the registrations, and we quantify the amount of deforestation legal reserve occurring inside of those overlaps. And so our hypothesis was that when confronted with a land claim, a landholder will either clear that land to exert their claim, or they will designate it as a legal reserve to sort of avoid the conflict. And so we tested for that at the municipality level, and then we did some modeling to understand how land tenure and accessibility are influencing overlap. So CAR overlap is a pervasive issue across the study area. It's increasing over time, so it kind of reflects the challenge for authorities to process all this high volume of information. By 2021, over 35 million hectares of the registered CAR is overlapped. That's about 16%, and over half of registrations have at least one competing land claim. So pretty staggering issue. So our first research question: how are landholders responding to conflicts? So we see clear strategies emerge at the municipality level. So in this map, you can see the dark green municipalities are where we found statistically more legal reserve in the overlapped or contested parts of properties than the non-overlapped parts. In the orange are where we found more deforestation. But probably most concerning are the municipalities in red. These are where we saw both more deforestation and legal reserve in the overlaps. So in other words, conservation gains established by one landholder through the declaration of legal reserve could then be offset by another landholder that's clearing that land. And we found that up to 9.7 million hectares of the legal reserve inside of overlaps is either double claimed or deforested during our study period. So it's because an overlooked form of forest code non-compliance here. Zooming out to the regional level, we used our modeling to understand where CAR overlap is more prevalent. So the single most important factor in our model was property size. Larger the registration, the more overlaps you get. And you can kind of see these hotspots here in the map of these super registrations. 10 hundreds of thousands of hectares that have dozens and dozens of overlaps with other properties. And we actually found a size threshold around 3,000 hectares. Beyond that, the number of property overlaps increases exponentially. Variables associated with weaker land tenure were also associated with more property overlap. So registrations on undesignated lands had about 8% more overlap, and registrations on untitled lands had about 15% more overlap. Interestingly, in the registrations in the main soy producing regions, if my animation works here, registrations in the main soy producing municipalities were both larger, but they had fewer overlaps. So this could be a formalization effect brought by the policies targeting the soy sector. That'd be an area of further causal research, but suggests that car reliability could be improved with supporting initiatives. So kind of getting back to that policy mix idea. All right, and finally, is self-declaration the right mechanism for supply chain traceability? Well, you certainly get a large volume of information on land user data with this self-declaration mechanism. So you get relatively low-cost monitoring without formal enforcement happening. However, as that volume of information becomes greater and greater, it starts to challenge the authority's ability to process it all, and then it leads to these overlap issues and data quality issues. And so here's which certainly challenges the enforcement of these zero deforestation strategies. And so here's want to end on a few policy recommendations based on our findings. So you could use car records to assign shared liability for illegal deforestation. So if you can publicly claim land in the car, you should be liable for any illegal land use on it. Next, you could use overlaps as objective evidence of land conflicts to trigger field inspections before issuing land titles. So just as the car should not be used to bolster a land claim, a car record could be used as evidence against that land claim. And then finally, automatically update the car with titled properties and cancel any new registrations that overlap those titled properties. Right now, the car and the titled property data sets are not well integrated. And so, yeah, just want to say thanks to all of our collaborators on this, to Stanford for funding this research, and there's a little link to our paper if you're interested in reading more. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everyone for being here, and I just want to firstly introduce myself. My name's Anthony Alexandra. I'm a lecturer in a business school in the UK, University of Sussex, and I've been working on collaborative projects with people in different disciplines for some time, including geographers and environmental scientists, and currently with colleagues in the School of Law. And what I'm going to describe in this short presentation is just a little bit of the perspective on deforestation and supply chains from the perspective of sustainable supply chain management as a business studies issue. And then the approach that the law school has on this, people in legal studies, is again to do with supply chain governance. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then about how we're seeing regulation changing. Everyone's talking about the EUDR, and we'll put that in context. And then how we're also seeing changes in the nature of enforcement. And this is something that's going to be in a state of rapid transformation in the course of the next year or two. International Journal, which describes one of our projects, and my colleague Emanuela Orlando has co-edited a book on socio-legal approach to environmental harm. So you can see that there is a lot happening on these topics in other disciplines. So here we go. A little bit more about the background. So I did my doctoral studies on sustainable supply chains, then did various small projects on deforestation policy, and did some field work in Peru, and most recently, the one I'm going to talk about most today, is developing an IT platform ahead of the UK's Environment Act, which people have referred to. And the idea here is, how do you get to a neutral, trusted entity that can provide data? Pointed out the wrong way. Hang on. Okay, so this project was called ForestMind. It was a research consortium that included retailers who needed to establish due diligence of their supply chains. There were importers, a lot of agricultural and earth observation consultancies and policy advisors, and this was ahead of the actual regulation coming into force. So when the UK hosted the climate COP in Glasgow, there was the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests, which brought together a different set of governments to commit to a long-term policy trajectory. And you also had the UK bringing out its particular policy on due diligence for forest risk commodities. And as people have mentioned previously, the powers have been granted to the government to issue fines, but we're now waiting on the secondary legislation to detail that. So the EU policy has now got ahead of the UK one, and that's currently under review to see what will happen. From the perspective of sustainable supply chain management as a field, just point to a couple of theories here, which is that in order to understand a supply chain, you need to be able to have some idea of what's happening in it. So there's an information transition that needs to occur. And the theorization of this helps to understand where some of the constraints are. And in particular, it's around the fact that you can find out all sorts of things about a supply chain, but it will cost. And so if you then produce a cost without a benefit, that will incur resistance. And this is where in legal studies the socio-legal approach is about what is the impact, the societal context or the economic context into which that regulation appears. So in order to establish effective regulation, you need to ensure that the laws will actually achieve the desired outcome and not get overturned. And we've seen precedents in this with other sustainability issues in supply chains, such as conflict minerals and modern slavery. So we're looking at how the deforestation due diligence is forcing information to be extracted from higher up the chain. So the idea of a farm to fork model is now producing new forms of sort of supply chain data. And then if we look at how this is being driven by regulation, we have to ask, how do you get data from that supply chain sufficient to actually prosecute in a court of law? So this is going to be what's developing over the next year or two, is the processes for actually getting that quality of data. And if you're a prosecutor, you don't want to go into court with just one piece of evidence. So we're looking at how do you get multiple sources of evidence in order to produce absolute watertight guarantee that you'll be able to prosecute and issue a large fine. So previous speakers have talked about some of this policy context. So we've had voluntary targets since 2015. That's now produced mandatory measures. We've had the UK Environment Act passed but not yet activated. We've got the EU one passed, slight delay. We also had the US Forest Act, which was very similar, not passed. Maybe it will return again. And in the New York State, they've produced their own one that applies to public bodies only. So those are all quite sort of strong indications of the direction of travel. So just looking at a couple of the examples of the mapping data here, obviously we've seen that we can have the EUDR Forest Observatory map, but quite low resolution. We've seen examples of different sort of concession mapping produced, and then this is one from the ForestMind project, which again, just looking at field boundaries, slightly different levels of data being added. And there is a paper on that methodology for those that are interested. Just search for the title ForestMind and you'll find it. Heiko Blatzer and colleagues. But what I'm going to talk about now is another aspect of that program, which was the use of stable isotopic ratio analysis in order to actually detect the origin of a specific item. So rather than just trying to detect a map with a self-declared piece of information, using this isotopic analysis, you can take a piece of a material and then compare it against a base map that shows a landscape with varying degrees of accuracy, but there's a program underway to start sampling different landscapes in order to establish their isotopic characteristics. So the way it works is that you have different chemical isotopes that are stable, so they're not decaying, and these are very specific to the uptake of those common chemicals into plants as they grow. So we can see here a sample there from West Africa, and the color map is showing different characteristics of those. There's a large project underway through an organization called World Forest ID that is sending out groups working with the scientific institutes of different countries to get this base map built up. And this then allows, through the collecting of an app, the sampling in various country-by-country basis, allows the accurate detection of the origin of a particular product. So now you can use this for establishing things like counterfeit goods being introduced into a supply chain. So a lot of the customers are coming from food retailers who want to establish that their products come from where they are supposed to be from. And it's also now being used to prosecute for the illegal smuggling of timber from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've had the authorities in Belgium able to actually seize 260 tons of timber using this technique. And there's a paper there in Nature Plants that describes how this is occurring. So what we have here is we have a much more solid evidential base to add to the additional processes in order to then establish additional evidence to go into the processes of enforcement. Now, what we don't have at the moment is this system being embedded into the EUDR. What we actually have is this process being used for lots of other forms of analysis or policy. Now, what we find here is, of course, this is coming from essentially security funding. So it's coming from conflict-related foreign policy, not conservation policy. And of course, the resources there are much greater. So we're seeing a technology that's available, but it's being applied in different ways. So this is an interesting example of how we actually have what we're starting to call concurrent policy. So the more effective forms of prosecution for the smuggling or illegal production of forest risk commodities is actually coming from anti-corruption measures, money laundering, fraud, conflict sanctions, and then in addition we also have companies acting on the basis of scope 3, carbon, as Paul was just saying, and also human rights. So that's all I wanted to say. Just happy to introduce you to that particular piece of work. Thanks very much.
Okay, is this on? Okay. Hi everyone, thank you for sticking around for all the presentations today. My name is Charlotte Sedlock. I'm with the University of Michigan, and today I'll be talking about smallholder farmer exclusion in the context of market-based sustainability governance. So we've heard already some great introductions to the EUDR. I'll be very brief. So the EU deforestation regulation, which is set to go live at the end of this year, is requiring that traders and operators who are importing products and commodities historically associated with deforestation have to demonstrate at the polygon and the land level that those commodities and products are not associated with deforestation. And this has brought a lot of tension between the EU and producer regions, so much so that the EU is considering pushing back the regulation a year to give more time for stakeholders to comply with these requirements. And one of the reasons why the EU is considering delaying the EUDR is related to the fear that smallholder farmers are going to be excluded from these global value chains. And as we heard earlier, smallholder farmers are major stakeholders in these global value chains. So we wanted to understand the evidence behind this potential environmental responsibility regulation and the social responsibility tensions. And before I dive into that, I think it's important to call out that there's already been amazing scholarly work done that recognizes that smallholder farmers face many barriers already to participate in global value chains. But what we wanted to better understand is how does market-based sustainability governance that Paul introduced, how does that impact the structure of the upstream supply chain? And what I mean by market-based environmental governance is this is private voluntary certifications and standards like food safety requirements, organic requirements, fair trade, government-specific requirements like the Indonesian sustainable palm oil requirements, and buyer-specific governance requirements, which Paul mentioned, which can be zero deforestation commitments or requirements to abide by a code of conduct. And we feel, the clicker works, if that we have a good sense on how historically the market-based sustainability governance has influenced the EUDR, that might give us, or has influenced upstream supply chains, that will give us insight into the potential of the EUDR impacting smallholder farmer participation in global value chains. See if it works. Okay, I just said that. So what we did to start off this research is we first began with a systematic literature review that set out to answer how does market-based sustainability governance impact smallholder farmer exclusion? And more importantly, how do we as scholars measure smallholder farmer exclusion? Because if we're able to have a grasp on the methods, then we can potentially think about how do we scale these types of studies to match the scope of the global EUDR. So I'll be very brief, but with our systematic literature review, before I do that, exclusion can be defined a lot of different ways. And so for this work, how we think about conceptualizing exclusion is it's an involuntary exit of smallholder farmers from global value chains due to market-based sustainability governance. Again, so we were interested in this, how does market-based sustainability governance, like zero deforestation commitments, like the EUDR, impact the upstream structure of supply chains, and how does that influence smallholder farmer participation? So, very briefly, we took the systematic Prisma format to do our systematic literature review. In my supplemental slides, I'm happy to go over our inclusion criteria, our search terms, the databases, all that good stuff. But we pulled 1,100 papers, and for our preliminary screening, we narrowed it down to 184 papers. So we read 184 papers, and what might be surprising is of those 184 papers, only 27 had methods to identify and measure market-based sustainability governance smallholder farmer-driven exclusion. And this might be surprising that we only had 27 records that we ended up pulling. And the reason why many papers were excluded was they were either review papers or didn't have empirical evidence. They weren't focused on market-based sustainability governance. They were not directly measuring participation, or the focus was on how do smallholder farmers adopt these governance mechanisms. But what we were more interested in is how do these governance mechanisms impact the structure of the supply chains. And so similar to past reviews that have been done on smallholder farmer exclusion, the evidence of exclusion is mixed. We've seen studies that have concluded that there have been threats of exclusion, evidence of exclusion of smallholders at the hands of sustainability governance, and evidence of no exclusion. These studies have been done globally. Primarily, the focus has been on food safety requirements and organic requirements. But of these 27 papers, what we noticed is that there's two general approaches to how we as scholars measure and identify exclusion. And I'm going to pull 6 papers to give examples of those approaches to measuring exclusion. The first is that we as scholars identify exclusion at the initial stage of the supply chain. So with the farmers, doing qualitative interviews with these farmers, asking them, have you been excluded of this supply chain and why? And we noticed some similarities with these papers. About 2/3 of the 27 papers take this approach of interviewing the smallholders. We find that they're often specific to a single country, specific to a single commodity. We're doing cross-sectional interviews, so we don't have longitudinal data on the market participation. And then the focus is really on interviewing the smallholders again, seeing how they are influenced by the change in the structure of the supply chain. And this is really important work that we need to build on. If we're thinking about the EUDR, that is going across multiple regions and multiple commodities, how can we scale and think about these type of methodologies that can have results that are region agnostic and commodity agnostic? And we noticed one other type of approach to measure smallholder exclusion, and that is through looking at the middle of the supply chain. So that's looking at the exporters, the importers, and the downstream actors, and seeing how are they influencing the structure of the supply chain and who is participating in that supply chain. And that was about 1/3 of the studies that were pulled in our systematic literature review. And what we noticed about these is because the focus of these studies, again, are at the middle of the supply chain where commodities and products are being aggregated, where these exporters and buyers are sweeping across multiple regions and multiple commodities. There is more opportunity to look at wider regions, multiple commodities, and to even at times have studies that were using longitudinal data to capture participation over time. And we also saw more quantitative approaches to identifying exclusion, whether that be through econometric analyses, upstream supply chain mapping combined with GIS techniques. We saw a variety of methods when we're looking at the exporters and buyers to determine smallholder farmer participation in the global value chains. And this is really important insight of these two approaches for us as scholars if we're trying to think about how many and the frequency and severity of smallholder farmers exclusion due to something like the EUDR. And it's important to think about if we're trying to devise studies that are identifying and measuring exclusion, we need to recognize structural challenges that are associated with supply chains that exist today. A few of my fellow speakers already mentioned those, but I'll talk about them very briefly. The first is opacity, and I think this has been covered by many folks. Supply chains are hidden and opaque for a reason. You know, suppliers don't want to disclose who they're sourcing from, who their customers are, from a competitive advantage standpoint, also from an intellectual property standpoint. And this can be really troubling to measure exclusion. If we don't even know who is in the value chain to begin with, we're not going to be able to understand if exclusion is happening. Second, we have informality in our supply chains. And what I mean from informality is regulations that may happen, or transactions that are happening not in a regulated environment. And the informality is critical for economic and livelihood development, but if we're trying to understand exclusion, it's very difficult to get data around informality and informal transactions. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, participation in supply chains is dynamic, and we need to think through as a community, how do we conceptualize exclusion further? So a farmer may be excluded from the European supply chain, but they're included in an Asian supply chain or a domestic supply chain. So we need to think about, how do we understand how participation changes over time, and thinking about ways to conduct more longitudinal studies and data to understand how participation is dynamic and what is happening if you become excluded from a certain supply chain. And as Anthony mentioned earlier, what I want to call out is that the EUDR is telling traders and operators, use geospatial data science and databases to assess compliance in your supply chains and subsequently smallholder farmer participation. And so if we want to get a grasp on how the supply chain is responding to the EUDR, we need to follow the recommendations and pathways that traders and operators are going to be following as well. So what we plan to do next is essentially follow the footsteps of the traders and operators, again, because they are the ones sourcing across multiple commodities and multiple regions, and we know that power asymmetries exist in supply chains, to see how are their decisions influencing smallholder farmer participation. And what I want to leave you guys with, as some of the previous folks have mentioned, is what role can geospatial data science and artificial intelligence play in helping scholars improve traceability in supply chains to begin to identify how participation is changing over time. Now, there's a lot of amazing scholars in this room that are using these types of methods that, when combined, could really bring visibility to these supply chains, particularly at the upstream stages. And by doing that, then we're going to begin to have a lot more insight about who is included in supply chains and why, to really understand, is sustainability governance driving smallholder farmer exclusion? Thank you for listening, and we're happy to take questions as a group.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Now we have space for questions, right? Who wants to?
So my question goes to Paul. I was wondering if the conflict that you see is just about the boundaries of the property, or it's between large farmers, small farmers. Which kind of conflict you're talking about there? And the other question is in terms of, do you think that cars can be used to legalize illegal land grabbing?
All right, so for the first question, so we took a number of pre-processing steps to eliminate like marginal overlap. So I think we filtered out any overlap less than 1 hectare, or like a hectare or less, because we didn't want to just include these minor overlaps that could be due to measurement error. So that was kind of the threshold we set. And we took a number of other pre-processing steps to eliminate artificial overlaps due to like, what is the word? Sustainable management areas that include a lot of smaller properties, but it doesn't represent a true overlap. So yeah, we took painstaking steps to kind of clean up the data first before applying the overlap analysis.
But the overlap is the conflict, not between large farms and not large farms.
No, yeah, the overlap is, it's a conflict by definition, because land cannot be owned by the same person. It can't be claimed by the same person. So, and in the registry, you see two farmers or two landholders claiming the same land, or 3 or 4 or like dozens. So there's a large number of overlaps in certain areas.
Thank you, Paul.
We have to follow.
Thank you for the great session. I'm Manuela Alencar from Amazon Environmental Research Institute. And one thing that always comes to my mind as a remote sensor and how to apply that to policy is that sometimes we have the best data, but it's not used because the government wants to use a specific data. And I mean, in the case of Selo Verde, in the case of that, I mean, the UDR, we have these conflicts of data sets. So Britaldo and Felipe are putting together very refined data, but that's not the official data. But maybe it's going to be the state official data. So that is this, what I want to bring here, and I want to hear from you, how to deal with that. In our, I mean, we heard today about the golden era of remote sensing, and we have tons of data sets on remote sensing, but this has to be, how can I say, government bought, or private sector bought, or multilateral bought. So how do we think we should deal with that issue?
To whom is the question?
The question about how to engage.
Yes, but to whom? To whom?
To everybody, to all of them.
Okay. Well, we can tell by our experience, right? So in Brazil, yes, the federal government only acknowledge official data like PRODES, although we have mapiomas, we have the Amazon system for detecting deforestation, and also we have the state official data. So working for Minas Gerais, we use the official data for deforestation developed by the Institute of Forest of the state. But we have to work with them. We have to co-developing this and also to implement these tools. So it's it's a lot of engagement, right? So I think with time and work, we can convince, especially the states government, to use the data that we are co-developing with them, but it must be a co-development.
If I just would add some information, engagement process is not a linear approach. You can have advances and setbacks, and you 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And of course, we have been working with the government staff, and we are learning that we need to open the parameters, the criteria, the maps, resolution, uncertainties, to deal with uncertainties in a transparent way, and say sometimes, stick to the science. we need evidence-based information, because you as a policymaker, you as a decision maker, can benefit from evidence-based information when you discuss with your stakeholders, and it includes soy industry, cattle, and so on. So it's a process that you have to open the data, open the criteria, discuss about the uncertainties, and work together to reach official data. And of course, we recommend them to uptake official data as a means to advance the agenda.
If I could add one more thing from the EUDR standpoint. So in my slides, I showed the EU Observatory, what Anthony showed as well, which was a kind of a global data set that traders and operators are encouraged to use to determine risk in their supply chains. But what I think is a little bit concerning is that the data can be coarse, and really to understand your supply chain, you need really granular data, which some countries like Brazil and Ghana may have. But for a small business that is just trying to even understand what GIS is in compliance with these laws, it could be really costly to figure out what data you need to use. And so there could be reliance on not the best data. That's maybe a global data set, which brings risk to other actors in the supply chain. So I think we're thinking about integration. We need to think about who is using the data, what type are they using, and what is the cost for maybe stakeholders in the supply chain to be able to using the right data to be making the right decisions.
Thank you. We have more questions here in the back, so we have to follow the order. You're the second one. She's the first.
Thanks. I'm Rachel Carmenter from the University of East Anglia, and thanks for all of these great talks. I wanted to ask 2 questions, one to Felipe and one to Anthony. First of all, I was interested in the Selo Verde, and I was wondering if you have any plans to include fire in your layers, because you were focused on deforestation, which I understand from the EUDR. But I was curious about if you've considered adding fire in there. So that's one question. And then the other was to Anthony. I'm involved in supervising a PhD student who is in the School of Law in my university, and she's looking at ecocide. And I wondered if, what your reflections on the potential of an international law on ecocide is. I'd be curious to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, we are planning to include fire at the property level. And we have already a model that simulates and account for official data. And then we are in the middle of this engagement process that to convince the government, and the government convince the stakeholders that fire occurrences at the property level will be an issue to display legality and deforestation as well. Not only cut down the forest, but forest degradation as a fire consequence as well.
Thank you. If I could just follow that as well, is there any ability to include landslips as a sort of source of deforestation? Because that's something I've come across that will produce a deforestation alert, but isn't due to actual human-led deforestation. I'm just curious about that. But on the ecocide question, there is a group of people working in environmental law around the rights of nature, which is a new and emerging field of legal scholarship. As a form of what I call concurrent policy, to influence things, I think it's probably very regional specific. So, for example, in New Zealand, I think it's quite advanced having that, the ability to look at something like a river with the legal rights of a person, in the same way that we look at a corporation as having the legal rights of a person. So it really depends on what jurisdiction you're talking about, but it is an agenda that's new and growing. But I find that things like human rights legislation is slightly further advanced in influencing environmental impact, because you can look at the rights of people to have healthy food, for example, or the rights to have, safe place to live, and those can also trigger legal proceedings that companies are now starting to respond to. So it's a fast-moving field. Thanks.
Yes. Hi, my name is Melvin from the German Federal Research Institute called Thünen, Institute of Forestry. And I would like to have some statements on EUDR and maybe some misconceptions. So we provide policy advice for the German Ministry on EUDR for the last 2.5 years. The first statement, remote sensing tools can be an option, but it not needs to be an option for EUDR regulation. So I'm a remote sensing specialist and land use modeler. The second statement is, the whole thing at the end goes to the National Control Authority or competent authority, and they have to evaluate now these statements from a smallholder, from a big company. And we are in discussions with these competent authorities. We develop it with the German one, a risk-based monitoring service. The EU member states have 27 of these competent authorities, but currently I would say maximum 10 of them may use remote sensing data. France, for example, is not using it at all. So they are going more on paper-based assessments. So in Germany, as a number, we expect 10 million due diligence statements per year. So the question is now how you analyze, verify, define illegality and violations. So I think AI in one way is an interesting tool, geoinformation as well. But what I learned is there's a lot of complexity, and you have to keep in mind these are bureaucratic organizations who are very slow, and they are not as fast thinkers as we are. So this is what I'm learning for the past 2 years. Political bureaucracy is really a challenge for that type of work. And so what we are doing in our risk monitoring is, at the end it will be a red, a green, and a yellow light for that lawyer to analyze these due diligence statements. Because they are not remote sensing experts, they are lawyers. So you have to keep in mind, if you use remote sensing, to translate it to these people who have no idea about the map. So thank you, and of course happy for a further exchange.
Hello. My question is mostly for Britaldo, but also for Felipe. So, Britaldo, you said that the animal level traceability was an anti-policy. So, Felipe, right, with Salo Verde, they're presenting about farm level tools. But now the governor of Pará has the goal of having all of the cattle ear tagged for individual traceability, in part in response to the EUDR. And I was just curious if you could say more about why you said it wasn't.
Yes, that's very interesting. You know, time and time again, the conservation and climate funds end up in the hands of the agribusiness. This is, again, this is one example. So our friends from some conservation NGOs are supporting this initiative with large funds.
From Jeff Bezos.
Yes, I want to say that, but okay. And it's impossible. You know, Brazil has now, we have more cows than people, right? And all sort of farming or ranching system, from small landholders to large agribusiness. So individual traceability, it's only possible for agribusiness, right? So agribusiness take advantage of this, but it won't solve the problem because they still buy the cows from smallholders. For example, the Chico Mendes Reserve, Resex, is a source of calves for the surrounding big ranches in Acre. So you can imagine the cost of tagging an animal, to track the animal, the whole life of the animals. It's okay in Europe, because I know, I've been in Portugal, so they say, oh, every animal has a tag, but the European Union pay $5,000 for cow. So you have a cow, you earn $5,000 without doing nothing. So it's good for the European Union, but in Brazil, forget about it.
Yeah, I would just add though that ADE Pará, the state sanitation agency in Pará, they've been working with us to estimate how many people will be needed to tag all the animals on small properties. So I feel like there will be a lot of effort to support smallholders to be able to participate in the ear tagging process. But I don't disagree. Everything's complex.
And in Brazil we have the sanitary system, the GTA, so we have to improve but not use it, right? So we have to take advantage of what is already established. Okay. First.
Thank you very much. Robert Manson from the Instituto de Ecología here in Mexico. I work with sustainable coffee and payments for ecosystem services. And when I see this, some of the same kind of learning processes come to mind, trying to evaluate additionality and the impacts of these payment programs. One issue that you didn't mention, but I think is important, would be leakage. So especially if these small landowners have different parcels in different places, they may be complying in one area and deforesting in another, just to see what the net effects are. And the other that Anthony mentioned just a little bit, but in coffee, for example, in Mexico is a big issue, is contraband. So if you can't sell because you're blocked, you're excluded, well, maybe you'll sell it at a lower price to the neighbor who then includes it in their inventory. So just gave a general comment.
You want to comment on that?
Good question. Of course, we are concerned about leakage and spillover and all effects. Of course, from a scientific point of view, we have literature demonstrating that. And legality is a tricky issue because, of course, you need to be compliant with the law, but there are some reasons behind the people that are not following the rules. But for us, it's very important to convince the government that the only way to combat deforestation is to be transparent. You have to put online or make it available, free available, illegalities and irregularities, but show the path for regularization. So it's very important to show the big picture, but show every one, not only the good guys, but the bad guys as well. But of course, as you can imagine, you can have some counterfacts and counter positive or counter negative actions behind this process. But this is an ongoing process, and of course, we are recommending the government to put as much transparency in the system in order to protect themselves as well.
Can I just make a quick point as well on that, which is that as well as having your sort of leakage at the producer country scale, if you think about the buyer, so from the sort of supply chain business perspective, if it becomes too onerous or too high risk to source from a particular location, they'll simply source from somewhere low risk. And so if you find that sourcing from any of these places is difficult, it's a very easy decision to say, well, we'll just source from Uruguay or somewhere else. Also, to substitute. So with the conflict minerals regulation, we found that some companies would simply say, well, if we're forced to produce due diligence because we use gold, well, we'll just substitute it for copper, which is cheaper, and then we don't have to do anything. And the UK regulation, which went on, you know, the regulation that's been approved, has a clause in it called comply or explain, which is a get out to say, either tell us how you've done your due diligence or explain why you can't. So there's these very, very, very sort of soft ways that the regulation doesn't necessarily, if it becomes too onerous, they simply will find other ways around it. So just add that.
I know we're at time, so I'll just add a point jumping off Anthony, because I think he pretty much said it, is if the buyers want to reduce risk in their supply chain. So what we've heard from stakeholders in certain industries is that buyers are already consolidating their supply chains and having market bifurcation in fear of, is there spillover, is there leakage, which brings social justice concerns to participation in these supply chains if we're proactively changing the structure due to these fears without visibility into who's participating in the supply chain. So we're seeing a lot of change already happening, and now we need to catch up and try to get the data around it.
Thank you. Any more questions? Can we adjourn the session? So thank you very much. Thank you very much.